Yamaha, KTM, and BMW are facing an enemy they never saw coming. It isn't another Japanese brand, and it certainly isn't a scrappy European startup. It is an entire automotive industry that decided motorcycles were worth disrupting, and they brought a trillion-dollar playbook with them. For years, we dismissed this threat. We said, oh, it's just cheap labor, or government subsidies are paying for it. You need to stop saying that. It's outdated. The reason these bikes are humiliating the establishment on spec sheets isn't because the labor is cheap. It's because the money behind them is terrifyingly huge. We aren't looking at motorcycle companies anymore. We are looking at automotive giants shrinking their technology down to two wheels. When you buy a KTM or a Yamaha, you are buying from a bike manufacturer. When you buy a QJ motor or a Vogue, you are buying from an industrial conglomerate that builds millions of cars. That difference is the trillion-dollar cheat code that is dismantling the European establishment. Today, we're digging into the supply chains, the engine tech, and the specific brands that are using car money to take over the bike world. Section 1. The electronic overkill. Why your screen costs pennies. Let's start with the most obvious difference: the stuff you stare at while you ride. Have you ever wondered why a $5,000 Zantes or CFMOTO comes with a full-color, high-resolution TFT display that looks like a smartphone, while a Honda, costing twice as much, is still rocking a monochrome LCD that looks like a Casio watch from 1995? It drives people crazy. You assume the Japanese are just being stingy, or that the Chinese screen will break in a week. But neither of those is the real answer. The actual answer is volume. In China, companies like BYD and Geely are pumping out millions of electric cars every single year. Every one of those cars needs a high-resolution dashboard. Because car companies make millions of these screens every year, the cost per screen drops to almost nothing. It's a commodity item, like a bolt or a washer. So when a brand like CFMOTO or QJ Motor wants to design a new entry-level bike, they don't have to call a specialized motorcycle supplier and negotiate a custom order for 50,000 units at a premium price. They just dip into the local automotive parts bin. They're using screens that were essentially developed for electric hatchbacks. The R&D is paid for, the tooling is paid for, the supply chain is already running at full speed. European brands have to order from suppliers like Bosch. They order smaller batches, so they pay more per screen. You pay for that difference. That's why premium features on European bikes cost extra, while on Chinese bikes, they're standard. And it's not just screens. This automotive trickle-down effect applies to everything electronic. Think about keyless entry systems, tire pressure monitoring sensors, and Bluetooth connectivity modules. In the car world, these are basics. They're everywhere, because the Chinese motorcycle industry is physically and financially tied to the Chinese car industry. Adding tire pressure monitoring to a $4,000 motorcycle costs them pennies. For a standalone motorcycle brand, integrating that same tech requires specific development and sourcing that drives up the MSRP. This advantage gets even more unfair when we look at the electric motorcycle market. The most expensive part of an electric bike is the battery. Well, guess who controls the global battery market? Chinese giants like KTM and BYD. They control the mines, the processing, and the cell manufacturing for the entire automotive world. If you're a startup electric motorcycle company in California, you're buying batteries at market rates, fighting for supply. If you're a domestic Chinese brand, you're part of the ecosystem. You get priority access and pricing that no Western competitor can match. This is why you see brands like Suron or Talaria exploding in popularity. They aren't just undercutting on price. They're leveraging a battery supply chain built for millions of cars to power thousands of dirt bikes. The electronic overkill isn't a gimmick. It's a symptom of a much larger industrial reality. The Japanese and European brands are trying to compete with motorcycle budgets, while the Chinese brands are playing with automotive surpluses. But here's the thing about fancy screens and Bluetooth. They don't make a bike fast. You can put a 4K TV on a bicycle, and it's still just a bicycle. The real test of a motorcycle isn't the dashboard, it's the heart of the machine. And for a long time, that was the weak link. The engines were weak, vibration-heavy copies. But that changed the moment the Europeans made a fatal strategic mistake. They decided to teach their rivals how to build proper engines. Section 2. The engine trap. How Europe trained its assassins. For decades, the biggest insult you could throw at a Chinese bike was that the engine was made of cheese. It would vibrate your fillings out and then explode at 10,000 miles. European executives slept soundly, knowing that while China could stamp out plastic fairings, they couldn't replicate the precision of a German or Austrian engine. But then, those same executives got greedy. They wanted to lower their production costs to increase their margins, so they entered into joint ventures. The logic was simple. We will provide the blueprints and the strict quality standards, and you provide the cheap labor and the factory. It worked great for the quarterly reports, but they underestimated that they were essentially running a tuition-free university for their future competitors. They taught the apprentice everything the master knew, assuming the apprentice would always be content working for minimum wage. Take a hard look at the relationship between KTM and CFMOTO. KTM needed a cost-effective way to produce their mid-weight engines, so they handed over the blueprints to the LC8C engine, one of the best engines in the world, and taught CFMOTO how to build it. They learned how to build precise engines that don't break. They learned the exact quality standards KTM demands. KTM assumed CFMOTO would always be content as the factory. They were wrong. CFMOTO took those lessons, combined them with unlimited Chinese capital, and opened a shop across the street. CFMOTO didn't just blindly assemble parts, they absorbed the DNA of the machine. The result? CFMOTO now uses that exact same engine platform in their own bikes, like the Ibex 800 and the 800 NK. You can buy a CFMOTO that has the heart of a KTM for thousands less, and the manufacturing quality is nearly identical because it's coming off the same line, built by the same people using the same European standards. It's a similar story with BMW and Lonson. For over a decade, Lonson has manufactured engines for BMW, including the parallel twins found in the F850 GS. Once they mastered those strict Bavarian standards, they simply applied that expertise to their own premium brand, Vogue. And it's not stopping there. New reports indicate CFMOTO is teaming up with Royal Enfield to co-develop future models. Even the kings of heritage are looking to China to secure their next generation of bikes. The result is that Chinese engines are no longer weak clones. They are legitimate, high-performance platforms built on European machinery. The engine gap is effectively closed. But having a fast engine is terrifying if the rest of the bike falls apart. They have the heart of the machine sorted, but did they fix the pot metal frames that used to rust instantly? That is where the car industry steps in again to solve the structure. Section 3. Metallurgy and Manufacturing. The death of pot metal. Let's be real about the elephant in the room. For 20 years, the single biggest reason to avoid a Chinese motorcycle was the metal itself. We even had a derogatory name for it, Chinesium. We've all heard the horror stories of bolts that snapped if you looked at them the wrong way, swing arms that flexed like noodles, and frames that started rusting before the bike even left the showroom floor. That reputation was earned. But that era didn't just fade away. It was violently disproven in the Saudi Arabian desert. If you want to break a motorcycle, you take it to the Dakar Rally. It is the most brutal motorsport event on Earth. It destroys factory machines from Honda and KTM that have decades of development behind them. Kove, a brand that didn't even exist a few years ago, decided to enter the Dakar with their 450 Rally. The entire industry expected them to fail. They expected the engines to blow and the frames to crack in the dunes. Instead, Kove sent 3 bikes, and all 3 crossed the finish line. Do you understand how insane that is for a rookie manufacturer? It proved that their metallurgy wasn't just good enough for the street. It proved they had mastered the material science required to survive the worst conditions on the planet. So how did a brand nobody had heard of build a chassis that survives the Dakar on their first try? The answer is a massive shift in manufacturing technology called high-pressure die casting, or HPDC. If you look closely at the frame and swing arm of a modern Zantes or that Kove 450, you won't see sloppy welds. In many places, you won't see welds at all. You will see complex single-piece alloy structures that look like they belong on a high-end Aprilia. This is not cheap manufacturing. They inject molten aluminum into molds at high pressure. This creates frames that don't crack or rust like old welded steel. The machinery required to do this costs millions of dollars. It requires massive industrial robots and precise temperature control. A small, independent motorcycle maker can rarely afford this tech. But because brands like Zontes and CFMOTO are backed by those automotive giants we mentioned earlier, they didn't have to save up for the robots. The robots were already part of the family business. They simply adapted car chassis manufacturing techniques to motorcycle frames, skipping the learning curve that usually plagues new manufacturers. This rapid improvement is driven by the speed of their R&D. Because they have automotive capital, they can speedrun development. They have access to wind tunnels, shaker rigs, and computer simulation software that smaller European brands can't justify buying. They can simulate 5 years of road abuse in a week on a test rig. They can iterate a chassis design 10 times in the computer before they cast a single part. They have moved from heavy, rusting steel to lightweight precision alloy that rivals the best from Bologna or Munich. The product is actually good now. The Dakar proof changed everything. Chinese brands went from a joke to a threat in less than a decade. The question now is, are you surprised by how fast this happened, or did you already see it coming? Drop a comment. I want to know. But making a good bike is only half the battle. You still have to convince people to buy it, and that is where they are forcefully taking over the market. Section 4. The market takeover. Design, branding, and logistics. They had the engines and they fixed the metal. But for a long time, the Chinese manufacturers had a massive problem. The bikes were ugly. They lacked soul. You can't reverse engineer cool in a factory. So they decided to stop trying to fake it and just bought it instead. Look at the strategy of CFMOTO. They realized they couldn't build a heritage brand overnight, so they purchased Benelli. They took a historic Italian nameplate, kept the design center in Pesaro to ensure the bikes looked emotionally compelling, and then funded the production with unlimited Chinese capital. The result was the Benelli TRK 502. It didn't just sell well, it became the best-selling motorcycle in Italy, beating local heroes like Ducati and Moto Guzzi on their home turf. That is the Trojan horse effect in action. By combining Italian design language with Chinese manufacturing costs, they solved the sole problem that usually keeps riders away. They proved that if the bike looks right and the badge has history, people will ignore the country of origin code on the VIN plate. Then there is the pricing power play. Chinese brands are effectively using the Hyundai strategy from the car world, undercutting the competition so aggressively on value that consumers simply cannot afford to say no. They leverage that massive scale of production to keep the out-the-door price 30 to 40% lower than the European alternative. They have the capital to absorb lower margins per unit because they are playing a volume game that boutique European makers can't survive. But the final boss battle is trust. The biggest fear every rider has is, where do I get parts when this thing breaks? For years, the horror story was that if a Chinese bike broke, you were staring at a paperweight in your garage for 6 months, waiting for a clutch cable to arrive on a slow boat. This is where the automotive connection is the ultimate fixer. These companies are not small importers working out of a warehouse anymore. They use the same shipping networks that move millions of car parts every day. Parts arrive fast because shipping a box of motorcycle oil filters is easy when you are already shipping containers of car bumpers to the same country. This has led to a shift in the dealership landscape. You aren't buying these bikes from a sketchy back alley mechanic anymore. They are moving onto mainstream showroom floors, sitting right next to the Big Four, backed by 2-year unlimited mileage warranties. They have the logistics muscle to guarantee the bike stays on the road, and that was the last excuse we had for not buying one. Conclusion: the New World Order. So, here is the new reality. The era of the cheap copy is dead. We are now living in the era of automotive-backed industrial dominance. European and Japanese brands aren't fighting small startups anymore. They're fighting trillion-dollar car companies that see motorcycles as a side business. The companies that refuse to innovate or lower their prices are going to vanish. Brands like CFMOTO and QJ are not a flash in the pan. They are the new baseline for value and performance. If the old guard wants to survive, they need to wake up, because the cars have arrived on 2 wheels. This is just the beginning. Next week, we're breaking down which European brand is most vulnerable to collapse, and the data might shock you. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.